the Constitutional Convention saved our democratic country from failing. The work done here at this convention is still in use today. How amazing is that?
Remember, Remember the Articles of Confederation had many weaknesses. Disrespect from other countries, the inability to tax, therefore making our government poor and ineffective. Fighting between states, the lack of a strong currency, and finally Shays' Rebellion showed that change was needed.
George Washington himself realized that without some drastic changes to our national government, America was doomed to fail. Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison realized the need for a strong national government.
Alexander Hamilton took the bold step of proposing that Congress call for a national convention. Congress reluctantly agreed to call for a national convention in 1787.
So let's review the blanks. No taxing power equals no money. Shays' Rebellion showed the weakness of the government. Delegates from 12 of the 13 states arrived at the convention, totaling around 55 delegates. Rhode Island was the only state that refused to send delegates. They believed that any changes to the national government would result in smaller states losing power and say in the government.
The delegates met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in Independence Hall, the same place where some of these same delegates met to declare independence from Britain. Some of the more notable members of the convention included George Washington. Washington was the president of the convention. He required utmost respect from all of the delegates, and his leadership led them through the long, hot 4 months, locked up tight in that hall.
James Madison was named the father of the Constitution for good reason. His prep work ahead of time really created the foundation for the Constitution. He also took detailed notes of the proceedings, which gave us an excellent idea of what happened at the convention. Alexander Hamilton was a believer in strong national government. He was very supportive of Madison and even proposed his own plan that many saw as too similar to a monarchy.
Ben Franklin turned out to be an invaluable member of the convention. He was quite elderly at the time, in his early 80s. However, his wise words guided the members through some tough debates and earned him the title of the Great Compromiser. Some of our founding fathers that you would have expected to be in attendance were not at this historical event. Thomas Jefferson was in France, serving as America's ambassador. He did, however, send many books and letters to James Madison to help him prepare for the convention.
Patrick Henry was what was to become known as an anti-federalist. He was a strong supporter of states' rights and didn't believe any good could come from strengthening the national government. He was still wary from the experience under Britain's rule. Let's review the blanks. Rhode Island refused afraid larger states would gain too much. Refused to attend because they were afraid larger states would gain too much power.
So add that in there. It should be Rhode Island refused to attend because they were afraid.
George Washington becomes the president of the convention. James Madison, father of the Constitution. Ben Franklin, the Great Compromiser. Thomas Jefferson, ambassador to France. And Patrick Henry. Where would our country be if it wasn't for Little Jimmy, as his friends like to call him? James Madison was the brains behind the convention. His plan, the Virginia Plan, completely revolutionized America's government. The original goal of the convention was to simply revise the Articles of Confederation.
The Virginia Plan proposed a government with 3 branches: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and a judicial branch. The legislative branch would have 2 houses, with representation based on a state's population.
However, not everyone was happy with the Virginia Plan. Can you guess who? The small states. The smaller states, like New Jersey, felt the Virginia Plan would allow bigger states to have all the power in the national government, and they weren't going to stand for that. Instead, the small states proposed their own plan, the New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan instead proposed simply carrying out the original goal of the convention. revising the Articles of Confederation.
Since the delegates realized they would be making some huge changes to the national government, which could possibly include overhauling the Articles of Confederation, a new rule was put in place. Everything that occurred at the convention was to be kept top secret until the end of the convention. All windows were closed, doors were locked, even in this hot summer month. Secrecy was so important because the delegates worried that if the general public heard of what was going on, they might revolt, or worse, close down the convention. If the delegates could finish first, they would be better prepared to face the public.
Let's review your blanks. The Virginia Plan completely created a whole new government. It proposed a government with 3 branches. The legislative branch would have
2 houses.
Original goal of the convention was to simply revise the Articles of Confederation.
Absolute secrecy.
As the debate heated between the Virginia and New Jersey plans, Ben Franklin stepped in and suggested that both sides work together to come up with a compromise. Roger Sherman, another delegate, created what would become known as the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise created 2 ways representation would be determined in Congress.
The upper house, the Senate, would have equal representation from each state. 2 representatives from each state would participate in the Senate. The lower house of Congress, the House of Representatives, would have representation based on a state's population. This idea was accepted by all. However, it created a new problem between the northern and southern states. Dun, dun, dun.
Southern states wanted to count slaves as part of their total population. Makes sense, right? This would allow them to have more representatives and therefore more power in the government. The North felt this wasn't fair since slaves were considered property by the Southerners. Do you see the irony here? The North, in which most states had outlawed slavery and did not support slavery, now are calling slaves property. And the South, who has always considered slaves to be property and has treated them as such, now wants to consider them to be people. Do you see the foreshadowing here? This struggle for power in Congress will be one of the causes of the Civil War.
Thankfully, the delegates once again reached a compromise. This time, it was the 3/5 compromise. 3/5 of a state's slave population would count as the state's total population. Slavery itself was a sensitive issue at the convention. Several delegates were against slavery, even some that owned slaves like Washington. However, some southern states threatened to pull their support if slavery was ended. The Founding Fathers decided to postpone any decisions based on slavery for future generations to solve. Kind of chicken, right? But you need to realize how fragile our country was at this time. It was worth it not to take such a bold stand to save America. The delegates decided that the delegates decided that the importation of any new slaves from Africa would end in 20 years from 1787.
Here's an interesting factoid for you. Slavery was obviously discussed in the Constitution. However, the word slave doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. Let's review your blanks. The Senate, which is the upper house, and the 3/5 compromise. Even after the end of the convention, not every delegate agreed with the Constitution. In fact, 2 factions developed: the Federalists, who supported the ratification of the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists who did not. More on that in another station.
According to the Constitution, 9 out of the 13 states had to ratify, meaning approve the Constitution before it could become official. Each state held ratifying conventions. New Hampshire became the 9th state and therefore made the Constitution official. However, every state eventually agreed and ratified the Constitution.
Rhode Island was the last. Doesn't that fit? They were actually a little forced into the ratification. America had cut off trade with Rhode Island, therefore kind of twisting their arms to ratify the Constitution.
Here's the year that you need to know.
1787.
The year the Constitution was written. Let's say it together.
1787.
Blanks.
Federalists supported. Anti-Federalists were against. 9 out of the 13 states must approve.
And
1787.